every leg of the journey of a product has seen a substantial increase in labor costs. And I just don't see any way that that gets negated by other deflationary pressures. Like even if fuel does come down, it won't be enough to negate that.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
This week on Power Supply, we speak with Samantha Jones, VP of Revenue at Rocket Shipping, and that's exactly what we're going to be talking about, Gary. You found Samantha on LinkedIn as a subject matter expert in the trucking industry, and we're going to be talking about a lot of the logistics that's going on behind the scenes, impacting not only hospitals and healthcare organizations, but really all of us, even in our day-to-day lives, and some of the market trends, which is going to be really helpful, I think, for everybody listening in.
Absolutely, Justin. I think your subject matter expertise in freight management from the trucking industry to rail to over the ocean is going to be a significant add to Power Supply and what she's going to offer. We're going to hear another piece that we haven't heard of in a while, and just looking forward to hearing her subject matter expertise in this field.
All right, we'll be right back with Samantha Jones.
I'm Hayes Walder.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A production of 17 Studios. You're listening to Power Supply.
Joining us now is Samantha Jones, VP of Revenue at Rocket Shipping. We're going to be talking about the trucking industry, and certainly the trucking industry has not escaped disruption either, Samantha. So really pleased to have you on the show. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. I'm looking forward to it.
This is going to be great, but first I got to find out, where do you live and who do you pull for exactly?
So I live outside of Kansas City.
Okay.
In the Kansas side, a small town called Tonganoxie that nobody can ever repeat accurately.
I can never pronounce it.
Right outside of Lawrence, Kansas. So that's the University of Kansas. I actually graduated from Kansas State University, which is Manhattan. Live right next to my alma mater's biggest rival. And of course, professional sports, this is Chiefs City. So I wouldn't really be from Kansas City if I wasn't a Chiefs fan.
Were you a fan of them when they were terrible for many years?
I've been a fan of them since I was born.
Okay,
so,
good
yes,
answer.
Game on, legit.
Yeah, I like it.
We've had a lot of good years recently, so it's been a little bit easier in the last few years. But
it's fun watching them ride to the top, though, right? I mean, that's the whole fun. Trust me, once they're up there for a while, it loses its luster. So it's the ride. You sit there and go through the painful times, and then that's your reward.
Yeah, baseball, no, not too much. We have a lot less good years than we have bad years, so it's a little bit harder to be a loyal fan on that side, but we are. But we won the World Series in 2014, and it's been pretty terrible ever since. So
nice. Hayes, are you going to say something? I was just waiting for you.
I'm good. I'll let you go ahead.
No, I was just going to say George Brett. It's one of my, I grew up, man. That's one of my favorite guys.
I was thinking Bo Jackson. I mean, that was an unfortunate career cut short. He was incredible.
He was
great. I was going to think, you remember George Brett and the old, what was it? The Pine Tar.
Pine Tar.
Yeah, that was always kind of cool. That's a kind of an iconic moment from Kansas City history.
Love it.
Yeah, my dad actually, he's met him because he used to I think he did like grounds work at a golf course that he frequented when he was in high school, and he lived like in the KCK area, not too far
Oh
from.
my gosh,
So
that's super cool.
yeah.
Super cool.
Well, let's dive into the trucking industry. I grew up in the great state of Maine, and we had two huge trucking conglomerates that were about a mile down the road from where I grew up. You know, if you see them driving up and down 95 on the East Coast, you'll see those companies. But, you know, we've heard a lot about strikes and all kinds of issues, labor disputes. And I thought maybe you could just kind of tee this up by talking about the current market conditions. But tell us a little bit about your background too. Like, how did you get into this industry?
Wow. So, if you ask probably 95% of the people in our industry how they got into it, they're all going to say, like, I don't know, I didn't mean to. And that's really the truth.
Just like healthcare supply chain.
That's right.
It's becoming a lot more well known. Our industry is, because of all the attention it's gotten, national news. Now the White House has a supply chain task force. Like, there's a lot more awareness around it now than there ever was. So I think, it's becoming a more popular major in colleges and universities. So we'll start to see that change. But I came into it only 4 years ago, and it was kind of just like I need a job and here's an opportunity. And I started as a management trainee, actually. I was with ArcBest ABF Freight at the time, and then just changed a couple of positions over there, did outside sales account management, and then moved into a director of enterprise sales there. And then in August, I made a transition to Rocket Shipping as the vice president of revenue. So to answer that question, I didn't really mean to get into it. I kind of landed in it. I ended up loving it. I'm very blessed, and making a career out of it.
Well, so Samantha, we see all over social media and LinkedIn. I mean, I follow you, and every day you got something going on, and you have a ton of followers. So hats off to you. You are a shining star in what you're getting going. So very cool.
Thank you.
You know, one of the great things about social media is that you can stand out, especially when nobody else is really talking about what you're talking about. I mean, we see it in the news and we read about it in the papers, but nobody's really producing content the way you are on the topic. And it has an impact on us, not only in our work lives, but obviously even our home lives. Why did you make the move over to Rocket Shipping specifically? And are you limited to healthcare there, or do you have a really broad base?
Yeah. Okay. So part of my transition was kind of through social media. So it's a good tie-in talking about both. What I've learned is that, there are quite a few sources of information that you can pull on in our industry. People who have data that they're able to capture CAS, FTR, JOC, all these sources. But what I kind of set out to do was, I'm trying to learn and educate myself more on the industry. I needed to be able to do that, to learn more and have more educated conversations, bring more value. I was in sales to my customers. And when I started doing that, I realized it's a lot of work. It's like 10 hours a week of research to try to go to all these sources. So, for anyone who follows me, kind of a pretty common theme for me is to just aggregate lots of different sources into one concise post or one market update video, and then try to give people 10 hours of research in 6 minutes, or, 7 articles in one post. That's kind of the basis of what I started doing, was just to be able to say, hey, look, my life's a lot less busy than some of y'all's apparently, because I can do this for 2 hours a week. And so let me give this to you, take it for what it is. And that just kind of took off on LinkedIn for me. And that's how I met Gabe, the CEO at my current company. And he was like, hey, I love what you're doing and I want you to do that here. And it was a good time for a move for me, because I had accelerated very quickly at my previous company and kind of plateaued for probably about 5 to 7 years, and I don't sit still very well. So it was a good time to consider something different, and it's been great.
So as far as your experience in healthcare and what the company does, are you limited to healthcare, or do you have a very broad base?
We're very broad. Yeah. So we service anybody who's moving freight. And so I have had several healthcare related customers in my life in the industry, both at my previous employer and now. But I mean, everything from manufacturing to retail to agriculture to healthcare. I mean, pretty much you name it and it goes on a truck. And so I've learned a lot of really cool things, how aerosols are made, how Mucinex and different pharmaceuticals are transported and all sorts of things once you get on this side of supply chain where you're talking with all these companies and understanding all the movement that has to go into the raw materials, the production, the distribution of all these products.
Samantha, can I just ask a question, kind of going back a little bit? I mean, during, the heart of the pandemic, I would say, deep in 2020, 21, I read, I heard, I saw where so many of the truck drivers are 1099, contractors. But then you had the others that obviously were employed, but there's a whole issue about being vaccinated, non-vaccinated. They couldn't drive, they could drive. Is all that just completely gone away in that industry, or do we still have issues with some of that?
Yeah, and the vaccination mandates never really took. So those dropped. There was a lot of concern around those. And I actually think what you saw is when everyone felt like that was going to become a mandatory situation, a lot of the people who didn't feel that aligned with what they wanted to do and they were kind of nearing the end of their career in truck driving dropped out and just left the industry. So that was kind of a contributor more so to attrition than anything else. And actually the biggest, where that had the biggest impact was the cross-border, because Canada did put that into effect. And Canadian drivers are the ones who bring a majority of the stuff down and then take it back up. And so that kind of became a big deal there, because any, per se, U.S. drivers who did want to carry a cross-border load had to be vaccinated in accordance with Canadian law. And so that just, again, sucked capacity away because they didn't want to have to deal with that, get the vaccinations, show the proof of vaccination and all of that just to get across the border. So that was where it kind of caused the most headaches, if you will. But that was actually just, I believe I heard that was just repealed as well, even for the Canadian side.
It's interesting you said that about people kind of retiring. And recently at a hotel here in Nashville, we had our meeting. The guy that did all of our luggage, handled everything for us. He was a 20-something year truck driver that retired, and he just didn't want to go into all that. So it was interesting how healthcare, nurses, people, caregivers are all kind of retiring. And that sounds like the same thing with the truck driving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of people, right, that was like, this is just whatever it was, too much stress, too much uncertainty in their personal lives that left the industries that they were serving in that time. And a lot of people left employment in general. I mean, if you look at employment numbers, they took a unemployment, or it wasn't unemployment per se. It's people who left the workforce, just said, I don't want to work anymore. So it's all the people, maybe it's the moms who were working just because they could, their kids were in school and they wanted a job. Well, their kids weren't all of a sudden in school and things changed. And so we lost a lot of the workforce, and still, now it's kind of been going back up, but we're not quite where we were pre-pandemic as far as eligible workers who are just choosing not to work.
Yeah, we're trying to get Gary to work, so this will be good.
It's so wrong. It's so wrong. Thank you. Thanks, Hayes. I'm working today, so
it's all right. It's all good.
It's all good. Well, hey, let me ask a question, and I'll do a little bit of work here, Hayes. But just to follow up, Hayes, you set it up. I've seen some other social media too, besides yours too, Samantha, on the trucking industry and the jobs, and where is it at now? Are we still looking for it? What is the current market condition on the jobs? We have tons of vacancies? Where's it going? Where do you see it like this year, at the end of this year for 2022, and then going into 2023?
Yeah. So I'm going to step back a little bit and just kind of explain what we faced throughout the pandemic. When we went into 2020 and we went into lockdown, freight just stopped. I mean, consumer spending just stopped. Everything just died for about a month or two. And every graph you look at, I surely have some on my LinkedIn, but every graph you look at, it's like, here's 2019 heading into the beginning of 2020, and it just drops. It's a straight line down. But then what happens is it hits that bottom and it's a straight line up twice as high. And so everything just surged back once people realized we're at home. Now we have to buy stuff. There was a lot of panic buying. There was a lot of trying to preparation, a lot of PPE buying, a lot of food, medicines, everything, all the purchasing from, hospitals and medical offices to get in supplies. And so things surged so quickly, but the problem is the damage was already done from that drop. I mean, layoffs happened. People had to be let go. People pulled out of the workforce because of uncertainty with home situations. And that really couldn't recover as quickly as consumer spending recovered. So it was a struggle to play catch up all through 2021. and into 2022. And we're not done with that. I mean, there's always going to be hiring efforts because there's so much attrition in this industry.
Because of the hours? Like, is it the working conditions?
I mean, how many 20-something-year-old guys do you know want to go drive a truck?
Actually, I've run into more than I thought I would.
There you go. That's good. That's
And I literally, there's somebody that has his own business, and you know, the grind of it just wore him out. And he keeps telling me, I just want to go drive a truck. It's really funny because he just, you know, wants to go do something that's more doing and less thinking, because he's been working his business since he was 18, and, you know, he's almost 50 now. But I think overall, you're right about that. And we had this big push to get everybody to go to college, right? And you have to get an MBA. So who's going to spend all that money on a bachelor's program and then go and drive a truck, right? Because in their minds, they're not getting a return on their investment in college.
Which is kind of like, which is funny because you can drive a truck and make $100,000
Exactly.
even just working a local route, or you can go take an entry level role for $50,000 out of college. So there's a little bit of a misconception there and a stigmatization around that. But what we've seen now is we had record numbers of entrants in 21, because all of a sudden there was so much money to be made in 2021 and even in 2022 that new authorities, I mean, like, just blew past records. And so new authorities is like an authority or a DOT number, like, given to an owner operator coming in saying, I bought a truck. You couldn't get a truck. Everybody was buying up all the trucks, and the price of a used truck went up like 350%. And so, you know, a lot of people came in and they paid premiums to do it. You paid ridiculously high amounts of money for the equipment that you have to operate. You know, your insurance costs were high, but there was so much money to be made, it was lucrative. And so in 2021, for anyone who was trying to manage freight, I mean, you just had to scrap your projections that you had made 2 or 3 years ago, and you paid 300% more than you thought you were going to.
I was just going to say, so that's contributing to inflation, just those market conditions, because every good that is being moved is impacted by this.
Every single thing that you use, touch, buy was moved on at least 2 modes of transportation at some point. And every single mode of transportation in 2020 and 2021 increased in cost. And so what we saw were, you know, every driver wanted in on that. And so a lot of guys were like, I'm going to go drive a truck. I'm going to make a lot of money. You know, you were making really good money. And then what happened is now, as rates have cooled off, I mean, spot rates are down 25% from last year. Contract rates are still good, but a lot of owner ops don't get in on those. They live by the spot market. You die by the spot market. That's what we say. And so a lot of those people now there's a record high number of authority revocations. So they're leaving.
What does that mean? Can you explain that?
Well, new authority is the people coming in, right? So now they're revoking it.
They're giving it up. They're you know, either choosing to, or they're being forced to. But most of them are choosing to because they got into it, right? You got a truck, you made a commitment, you made a career, but now you can't make the money you were making. And so a lot of them are leaving, and they're going to lease on with fleets. So they're going to drive for Walmart. They're going to drive for, you know, the Joe's Trucking, who has 50 trucks and wants another power only unit. And they take their trucks and they take themselves and they go sign on to be someone's employee. AB5 also contributed to that. If you heard about that out in California, basically it eliminated 1099 contract employees, and they had to either become a company or start working for the broker that they were, you know, moving freight for. So they might have left their own authority to go run under somebody else's. So we're seeing a lot of that right now. But
do they acquire their assets in that when they make that move? So like, because you just said they would buy these trucks at this inflated price because of the fact that they could make so much money, then the money reduces. So that obviously kills them, because unless they bought outright with cash, unlikely, they have this debt liability. So are these companies they're going to work for essentially removing that debt liability for them and then paying them something maybe in between?
Not likely, because it's not really it's not in the interest of those brokers to all of a sudden have to be responsible for equipment. You have to maintain it. You have to, do work on it. You have to keep it tagged and whatever else goes into it. And that's a lot of overhead costs that they would have to now assume, which that's the beauty of being a broker. You don't have to do that. And so if they wanted to take those guys on as employees, a lot of times what they do is they set up a lease agreement where They technically own the asset, but the driver's leasing it from them and leasing to buy whatever so that they can basically just
offload the ownership,
their payments for it. But that's also like, yeah, there's a lot about AB5 that is kind of tricky when you get into that, because a lot of those guys, once you don't feel like you own your equipment, are you going to treat it like you did before? Maybe not. Sometimes they do buy out the equipment, and then if you don't feel like you have that pride and that ownership in your truck and your trailers. So it is a risk for the companies that had to take on all that high priced equipment.
Samantha, we're talking about all this cost and the current market, the inflation where we're at. I think about gas, prices where they're at. And I think about the end users. We predominantly are in the healthcare arena, right? And we are having lots of conversations of supply chain on pass-through costs that are increasing, and letters are showing up. We have 5.7% increase on $1 million in spend, and all these things are coming forward. How much is that being passed on to the end user in the healthcare arena or in any other arenas that you've seen? How much has that gone up, and is it continuing to go up as well?
Yeah, I think the answer is almost all of that's passed on to the end user. But let's go ahead and think about a product and where it comes from. So this has been a year of labor union negotiations and strikes, and people demanding to be paid more. And so, we have to be fair. These people did above and beyond what we ever thought we would have to ask of our, longshoremen or our railmen or whatever it was. So kind of the conundrum that I keep talking about, I don't hear a lot of people talking about it. I don't think there's really an answer, is that inflation is up. Okay, it's been up because of all the costs that we had to move products and whatnot. But is it going to go away? I'm becoming less certain about, because the workers in Europe and Germany, all these countries in the UK and Germany, they already did this. They already did their rate negotiations and they got record pay increases. Okay, well, those are 3 to 5 year deals, guys. That's not going anywhere. So then you come here to the US, and we're still in negotiations with the longshoremen and other unions on the West Coast for our ports there. So everyone's been avoiding LA Long Beach like the plague and diverting for a year now, diverting their imports somewhere else. Those are going to be record pay increases. The rail, they already have record pay increases written in that a lot of them have ratified. That's not what's being disputed anymore. So we already know what those are going to look like, which, by the way, we still have a union that just rejected their ratification offer, and we have 2 more, I think, that are still up in the air on that. So we haven't actually avoided a rail strike. We've just continued to delay that a little bit more. But so you have your ocean, your rail, and your truck drivers, because usually things come in, they import, they get worked at the ports, they might go on the rail, and then they get offloaded and they're moved with a truck. And the payroll cost for trucking industry went up. So all of our truck drivers are getting paid more, and you had to pay them more to retain them and attract them because everybody was fighting over these truck drivers. So every leg of the journey of a product has seen a substantial increase in labor costs. And I just don't see any way that gets negated by other deflationary pressures. Even if fuel does come down, it won't be enough to negate that. Can you guys tell me a little bit more about specifically the people that you think, that come to you guys for information or that you talk to? Have they mentioned what mode it is that they primarily have had, issues with? Do they talk about more imports or domestic, increases?
I think I'll jump into that. I think and Justin and Hayes back me up on it. I think it's been all of what you've just said. The question that I haven't gotten answered, and I've even asked it on some other live streaming podcasts, is the rail. I don't get deep into the rail. There's not a lot of discussion, but OTO, absolutely. Trucking industry, because we depend on that. Think about that. We've got patients that are on the table. We're trying to get surgery supplies over passes. Weather never stops. We can fly it in sometimes, but we run into these issues where we'll do these mock issues where we have commanders in chief and says, what happens if, we had an earthquake or a tsunami or a hurricane that stopped that? These are real, and we have to plan for that, not just PPE, but all medical equipment for patients that are on the table. So I think OTO is absolutely one of those issues. The time to get capital equipment to take care of patients has absolutely been pushed way out. On the trucking industry, just making sure we get we'll go into inventory, and we'll go into inventory way too much, Justin, but the inventories, we've had to increase our levels because of the trucking industry and just making sure we have people and drivers. Pandemic, you said it well, Samantha, the pandemic, boom, everybody was on hold, but we still needed to get supplies. And then that surge took a lot of them in other different directions, and we're still trying to get healthcare to get it where it needs to get to. So I do want you to maybe speak a little bit, and I was typing back and forth with Hayes and Justin, is the relationship between rail and the trucking industry. I think a lot of our listeners don't know that or don't understand how that works together. And you've talked a little bit about that. So if you could talk about that relationship, I think it would be helpful as well.
Yeah, definitely. So kind of walk through again the past few years kind of helps us understand where we're at right now and what we're looking at in the future. In 2020 and 2021, when things were just so crazy, I mean, it was like gangbuster years for freight, right? We had more imports than we could handle in LA Long Beach because also historically, LA Long Beach has been the lion's share of our imports. That's where they come in. Now this year, it's been really cool to see. It wasn't instant. Like we couldn't just swing imports over to Houston in 2020 because the infrastructure just wasn't built up for it. It took us literally almost 2 years to really be able to capitalize. And now like New York, New Jersey is doing more than LA Long Beach, and Houston, Savannah, Charleston, all these ports are up anywhere from 10 to 30% in the TEUs that they're processing. So we've seen a dramatic shift of imports from the West Coast to the East Coast now, which is really cool. But prior to that, we weren't ready for that, especially, and like rail's a good example. The rail infrastructure on that side looks totally different than it does on the West. And so what we would see is we would see containers come in, they would port, and then they would go directly onto a rail. Because if you're bringing 60 to 70% of our nation's imports into California, well, guess where most of them are going? Not California. And if you're going to truck that across the country, you know, that's expensive. So historically, you could basically pay a fraction of the price to put it on a rail car, and it's, you know, cheaper, slower is the service you get there, right? So you save money, but it takes 7 to 10 days to get to, you know, Georgia, as opposed to 3 or 4 days on a truck. So you have to take that into account. Well, what happened during the pandemic is 7 to 10 days, more realistically, because of all the congestion and the inefficiencies, became 10 to 20. And that just wasn't working for anyone because everyone wanted the stuff because they wanted the stuff, right? If you didn't have it, you weren't selling it. You weren't making money. And so that just kind of became a non-viable option for a lot of people. And also for the small guys, if you can't negotiate secured space on the rails, you're at the mercies of IMCs, who are like brokers for rail, but even they were getting their allocations cut. So they were having to cut out customers. So a lot of these people had to shift away from rail to truck. And that's where, again, I mean, you just saw a crazy influx of freight out of California. You could run out of California for $7,000 to $10,000 on your truck, when now it's like 3 to 4, right? So these people were still making money, but the theme of 2020 and 2021 was operational efficiencies, not pricing efficiencies. Nobody cared anymore about rates. It was like, if we don't have it, you can't sell it. We have no money. So we might as well they passed it on to the consumer, and the consumers were willing to take it. And, you know, that's how they had to do things. So fast forward, we get into 2021. Rail is always, it never stopped being used. It was still being used. We actually, interestingly enough, we saw a shift away from, think about like tankers. Tankers move on rail, your fuel that literally goes into the ground and stuff like that. A lot of that gets moved on rail, or at least the raw products that go into the actual oil before it becomes gasoline, moves in these tankers on the rail. Well, there weren't a whole lot of people driving in 2020. So there was a lot less that needed to be moved around, and space that was allocated to that could then be given to high paying CPG freight. Everybody wanted, what did everybody want? Like an electric scooter for their kids or something like that to go do. And everybody wanted to have a nice, pretty yard. And everybody wanted, you know, a gazebo now.
Yeah, hot tub, decks, all the raw materials to build.
That is already like expensive as it is, and you can afford to play with your margins and your freight costs. It all just, you know, started moving. So the rails were capitalizing as best they could to make up for the volumes that were down in other places by, you know, allocating it elsewhere. And a lot of that still moved truck. If I was importing 5,000 hot tubs, I'd put 2,000 on trucks to get them where I need them in time. And then I'd have my backups coming in on the rail for half the price, whatever it is.
So you sell hot tubs too?
That's how it's called hydrotherapy in the PT world. That works.
If it wasn't only like hot tub season, like 3 months out of the year in Kansas, then I might be interested, but usually it's like 98 degrees.
So let me ask you this question. You're talking about operational efficiencies, right? That's what everybody focused on once, price went bananas. And what's interesting in the healthcare industry is you can't do much about the price because you kind of are the consumer. And so when you said nobody cared about the costs anymore, that was more what we were all doing as general consumers in the general public. But in healthcare, cost is controlled, right? So they cared about it and they're getting some assistance, but for the most part, they cared about it, but there was nothing that they could do about it. They had no negotiating leverage. And at the same time, the only way to offset that were operational efficiencies. And so I'm interested to kind of a couple of things here because we're getting close to the end. But the first really is what kinds of operational efficiencies from a logistics perspective, and maybe there's something that healthcare organizations can even be thinking about, because everything that you're talking about was really outside of their field of view. They were just impacted by it, but not necessarily unless somebody in healthcare was working as their third party logistics, then they were, that partner was probably quite well aware. But the people working in the hospitals, not as much. Might have an eye on it, but don't necessarily know how it's impacting, their bottom line and the prices. And again, like PPE, you mentioned that and what a huge demand that was. And even if you had a supply somewhere, how do you get it approved? There were so many things that came into play.
Yeah. I mean, I think you bring up a great point. And I would say, unfortunately, it's hard when you're not the one that's actually controlling the movement of the freight, right? That you're going to be purchasing. So if a lot of the people that you talk to are more in like they're buying from distributors, they're buying from wholesalers, and they're getting that product in, you do lose control over a lot of the input costs that go into that freight. There's not much more to be said about it. Or they could at least attempt, maybe if they have a pretty steady amount, you can control your freight from your distributor to you sometimes. That's a partnership that you can talk about having if you're moving a steady amount of freight. But there's not much else to be said. That's a really crappy answer. I know, but it's like,
it's just an answer nobody wants to hear. It doesn't mean it's a crappy answer. You're just telling the truth. Like you're kind of subject to the will of the market, and it's just where you sit in the supply chain that's how you're impacted.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are a lot of bigger players in the healthcare space who manage their own freight. Like I used to work with some big, they provided certain like curtains and things like that went into all the hospitals. And so people who do that, well, they fully manage their own supply chain from beginning to end because they had a big enough footprint that they managed their contracts with the ocean liners. They managed the freight once it got to port. But if you're, a smaller company acting more as a distributor or a wholesaler, you become dependent on your distributors. What I would say you can try to do, and now, this is kind of applicable because we've seen a lot of normalization in the freight markets, which is good. Things have kind of steadied out and we're seeing imports start to decline. A lot of people talking about a freight recession, a lot of people talking about a recession in general, right? I think that, by definition, we've been in a recession, but you wouldn't know it if you were in the freight markets because we are still moving so much stuff. And even in September, we imported more goods than we did last year. So there's a lot that's still moving. Manufacturing and industrial production domestically is up and it's holding steady. There's a lot of, really positive things. Construction supplies have actually increased in the last month, how much is being produced, which is people are like, wait a minute, isn't there a housing market crashing? No, not yet, because when you look at the number of single family homes that they went like this, well, the multifamily units are going like this. So like everything's still kind of somehow finding a pattern of holding and normalizing right now. Do you think it's going to soften in 23? So that would be my advice to anybody right now that's somehow affected by supply chain is that 2023 is going to be a year to focus on pricing and costing efficiencies. 2022 was about, I just want to get my stuff. How can I get it? I'll got to do what I got to do. I will pay a premium to shore up my capacity with my trucking companies. I don't care. I'm paying them 30% above what they got 2 years ago. I just need their truck. And so you bought your capacity, you bought your efficiencies. Well, now this year, they're not in demand as much as they were. in the last couple of years. And the power is kind of flipping back to the shippers, the importers, the BCOs to kind of go back and now negotiate rates. And so as they go back to negotiate these rates, they'll be able to chip away at the prices that are going into these products. And that's something where even like a distributor, if your wholesaler hasn't offered you concessions yet, or whoever you're getting your products from on shipping costs, and they're still saying everything costs the same, we've already been kind of steadily declining the second half of 2022 on rates. And there's going to be more in 2023 in Q1. And so if you find yourself in Q2 of 23 and you're not getting concessions from your whoever on shipping costs, that's something that I would be pushing to try to understand. But you have to know the market. You have to be able to go to them with information and say, I know based on these sources that spot rates are down 23% and contract rates are down 7%. So why are my costs still the same for my trucking?
That's the money quote right there.
Yeah.
She's giving us the money quote right there.
Well, that's the closing quote. It might be the bookended opening and closing, but honestly, good. You said you have to educate yourself. You have to find those resources. The other thing that you said at the beginning about how you've approached social media is that you consolidate those resources in a very efficient manner. So I just have to plug everybody going out there and finding you on LinkedIn and following the content that you're putting there, because not everybody has the time to do exactly what you said you do and become an expert in this area. But I think being knowledgeable about logistics, it's a key component of supply chain, right? Supply chain and logistics and healthcare, those market trends and understanding that. And I really liked how you put that was when you're working with them, when you're working with the companies that are providing the supplies, is what are the trends? And I need to understand why what you're doing might not be in alignment with the trends, right? That's kind of what you're suggesting. So,
and our industry is entirely cyclical. So there's highs and lows every couple of years. And if you're not paying attention to those, you don't take advantage of the lows and you just get stuck with the highs, right, year round. So that's also another thing to keep in mind is know the market cycles and where we're going. We're going into a kind of a low point. We're not going to get as low as we were in the last cycle, but we are heading down from where we were the last few years. And so, any number of things could change that in the next year. And if you take a year to try to, okay, it's 24, I want to save some money now. Well, for all we know, that cycle goes back up halfway through 24 and then you take increases again. So capitalizing on it while it's there, it's just the nature of the industry. It's always going to do that. I shared a graph in my last market update. Actually, it's on my LinkedIn page. And I pulled it all the way back to, I think it was 2008. And it was just like this the whole time. So take advantage of the lows.
Who did that?
I don't know who did that, but but Gary looks awesome. I got to ask one last question before we wrap up. So, or no, I'm going to make a comment and then we're going to close. But I'll tell you the problem or one of the issues in healthcare supply chain, and maybe we can get another guest on this because we had spoken with a number of folks from the Walton School of Business, and we're talking about inflation. And one of the reasons that it hadn't hit healthcare so much is because the length of the contract terms. So, in the trucking industry, you're probably seeing a lot of up and down fluctuation, right? Short-term price holds and things like that. Whereas, in healthcare, a lot of those agreements are a little bit more drawn out. So how do you anticipate those trends and apply those pressures in your contracting? Because as you see those ups and downs, you're talking about taking advantage of some of the lows or maybe building flexibility into the contract language around logistics. These things might already be there, but
I'm over here kind of smiling because I'm going to let you guys in on a dirty little secret.
Ooh, I love this. Go, go, go.
There is no such thing as a contract in freight. You can sign a paper all you want, but as soon as one person decides it doesn't work for them, it doesn't work for them. And so it's really not, it's more like a formality. And so, let's say you sign a contract that says, XYZ trucking company is going to haul this freight for me at, this rate. And then in 2 months, there's a snowstorm and they come to you and say, it's actually costing me 40% more to source capacity because of this. And so I need to change my rate. And then you don't get to say, well, the contract says, because they'll say, okay, well, somebody else will pay me and I'm going to leave. So there's always that balance of you have to make sure that your pricing is in line with the market, and contracts generally run longer terms, right? Like 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. There's too much cyclicality and change constantly in freight market pricing that makes those pretty much useless. A lot of people run an annual RFP, which by the way, I really encourage people to run RFPs if they're in a position to do so this year. But even RFPs during the pandemic and now moving forward, they've switched those from 1-year RFPs to 6 months to quarterly.
Wow.
Because they recognize that you can't.
Can you imagine running an RFP on a quarterly basis?
No. No, my gosh.
It's not applicable in healthcare, but
it changes so much. You can't.
Yeah.
You can't.
I can tell you I'm working a quarterly RFP right now for a Fortune 1000 company.
Well, that's different. Look at the volumes coming in there.
They have hundreds of millions of dollars of freight, and they have to bid it out every 4 months, every 3 months.
Because it moves so much, because of your point. Wow.
Well, that helps the people bidding on that have standard answers that they copy and paste and just update.
No, it's phenomenal, actually. I mean, if you have the ability to do it, which there's so many tools now to help with RFPs, you actually come out ahead because, again, you're eliminating risk from the people who assume the risk. And so the truckers are the ones who are actually having to agree to price something for a year. And they don't have a crystal ball to know where like rates are going to be in 12 months. So if they say they put their reputation on the line to say, I'll run this at $3 a mile, and then all of a sudden everyone around them is making $3.60, what do you do? Do you ruin, do you pull away your partnership and go chase the money? Because it's there, you could, and that's what happened. That's another can of worms. That's what happened in 2020 is the spot freight was paying so much more that truckers had to decide how much, you either need to give me a 30% increase or I'm taking my capacity out to the market. And that happened all the time. So another thing about contracts, and this is the only industry I know of where the people who provide all the services don't get to write the contracts. It's the purchaser. The person purchasing the services controls the contracts.
All right, Samantha, phenomenal job. And I know you did great because we definitely extended this interview out because I bet we barely got started. And I'm sure we could talk for quite some time. So we're just going to have you come back on the show again in the future and give us another market update. It'd be cool to do something, maybe not quarterly, but to have a regular market update from you, even, out on the social media channels, right? Or we could share one of your videos if you have like a healthcare market update or something targeted to our supply chain audience. We happily share that out too. So we'll talk about things like that, but I'm super impressed. Great interview. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks guys. It was fun.
That was Samantha Jones, VP of Revenue at Rocket Shipping, and we're talking about the trucking industry today. And Hayes, I just thought she was a wealth of knowledge when she talked about doing that research, spending that time, and then sharing that information on LinkedIn. It really shows. It shows what a self-learner she is, and she's become a master of this industry and a subject matter expert and all that market trends and where we're going. I think there's definitely some good insight into why things have been the way they have been, especially over the last several years. But I'm interested to hear just from our listening audience at some point how they can apply, some of those logistics concepts to their contracting. Because like she said, there's going to be an up market and a down market. And in the trucking industry, they're doing an RFP every 3 to 4 months. That's insane.
Absolutely. She had an amazing ability to know about all the different sectors, how it worked. I was amazed, and her communication, she's flawless. She really has a great understanding of what's going on out there. We're going to be impacted with issues around shipping for some time, and she really has a good understanding of that. I enjoyed it immensely.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this episode. But as a reminder, we'd love it if you download our smartphone app for iPhone and Android. It's the best way to listen to the Power Supply podcast. You can also search various topics. We're really building quite a library of episodes here at Power Supply. But if you're already listening to podcasts on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts, you'll find us there, as well as iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Spotify, or you can simply search for Power Supply on your favorite podcast application. Also, just mention in the outro that we'd love to hear from you. And I definitely want some insights. We can read your feedback on future episodes if you'd like. If you have topics or follow-up conversations that you think we should be having related to this episode or other ones that you've listened to, just send us an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. On behalf of Hayes, Gary, and myself, thanks for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply.